Now, we are devoting ourselves to a personality who still fascinates many people today. A figure whose story teaches us that the extraordinary is often hidden in the ordinary. We are talking about Alois Irlmaier, a man who started out as a simple well digger and became one of the most famous seers of the 20th century. But before we get to his famous 7 prophecies, we need to understand him. Who was this man really? And why do his words still touch us? Imagine a small town, Freilassing in Bavaria, shortly after the First World War. People are working hard to rebuild their lives. And in the middle of it all, a man getting his hands dirty, digging wells, looking for water, making the lives of ordinary people a little bit better. That was Alois Irlmaier. Not a prophet, not a saint, but a worker. One of many. And that is precisely what makes him so fascinating. Because Irlmaier never saw himself as the chosen one. He was not a man of great speeches, not someone who wanted to stand on a stage. On the contrary, he repeatedly said that he was just a tool, guided by a higher power. And people sensed that. They met him like they would an old friend. There was no fanfare, no show. Just this quiet man with a gentle voice who always knew things that he couldn't really know. His first visions came during the dark times of the Second World War. Imagine that. Families who were afraid every day to receive news that their son had fallen at the front. Mothers who desperately hoped to at least know where their children were. And then came this man from Freilassing. Someone who hadn't studied, who didn't wear a uniform, but who could tell people whether their loved ones were still alive. And where. He described places, villages, rivers, as if he were standing right in front of them, even though he had never been there. For example, there was the story of a young man who was missing at the front. The parents came to Irlmaier, their faces marked by grief. Irlmaier closed his eyes and remained silent. Then he said, "Your boy is still alive. He's in a Russian camp behind a river. There are birch trees nearby. He will come back." Months later, that's exactly what happened. How could that be? And this was not an isolated case. There are dozens, hundreds of such stories. People who asked Irlmaier to find missing relatives. People who asked him to get stolen things back. And he was always right. Once he even convicted a thief by simply describing what the man looked like and where he had hidden the stolen goods. But here comes the crucial point. He never asked for money. He said, "If I can help, then that's enough." And that's what people mean when they say he stayed down to earth. In a world in which many try to profit from the worries of others, Irlmaier was different. He warned against becoming vain. He did not want to make a big deal of himself. It was said that he often said, "I am a simple man. When I see something, I say it. But it doesn't come from me." And that's exactly what made him credible. Because he didn't brag. Because he gave people comfort, not fear. That is important. Because many people who hear about prophecies immediately think of gloomy warnings, of scaremongering. But Irlmaier was different. Even when he saw things that were frightening, he spoke about them calmly, without drama, without saying, "You have to believe me." On the contrary, he repeatedly told people not to live in fear, but to carry on with their lives, trusting in God. Many skeptics, even those who initially just shook their heads, eventually admitted it. There is something about this man. Perhaps it was his manner. Perhaps it was the fact that so many of his statements proved to be true. But those who met him had the feeling that they were meeting someone who was honest, someone who didn't want to play with the hopes or fears of others. And that is precisely why we still listen to him today. Because if a simple well builder from Freilassing had visions that could reach into our time, then it is worth listening to him. Not because we should be afraid, but because we want to understand what it means to take a look at things that we cannot otherwise see. Now, it's about how Alois Irlmaier saw the future. And when I say saw, I mean that literally. He himself described his gift not as a mere hunch, not as a vague gut feeling. They were images, vivid, colorful, sharp as in a movie. Imagine sitting in a dark room and suddenly a movie is playing on a big screen. Only this movie is not from Hollywood, but straight from another dimension. That's exactly how it felt for Irlmaier. And the amazing thing about it? He couldn't just switch it on. It came over him, unexpectedly, like a bolt from the blue. Sometimes, he said, he was in conversation, in the middle of working on a well, and suddenly everything around him blurred. The present faded, and another reality settled over the known world. Have you ever experienced a moment when time seemed to stand still? A moment in which everything around you became quieter, the space around you softer, stranger? Imagine that, only 1,000 times more intense. This is how Alois Irlmaier described the state he was in when his visions came. He was outside of time, he said, between the worlds. The people around him continued to speak, but he could hardly hear them. It was as if he had one foot here and the other there, in a place beyond space and time, a place where the future had already happened, and he only had to look at it. Irlmaier often spoke of a light. It wasn't just bright, it was alive, warm, and it was as if this light was coming to guide him. He said he never saw of his own volition. It wasn't his will that made him recognize these images. It was the good Lord, or a being of light, as he called it. This spiritual entity guided him, showed him what he was allowed to know. No more, no less. This light was his companion. It was like a silent guide that took him by the hand and led him through the events that were yet to come. And that is exactly what makes Irlmaier's gift so special. He never wanted it. He never saw himself as someone who had power over knowledge. For him, it was a burden. Imagine that. You see things that remain hidden from others. You know what's coming, sometimes beautiful, but often terrible, and you can't stop it. He once said that the hardest moments for him were when he saw destinies that made his heart heavy, when he saw villages that were burning, people who were suffering, wars, hunger, suffering. He knew what they were facing, and yet all he could do was tell them. There was nothing he could do to prevent it. This powerlessness was his constant companion. But Irlmaier was a man of principle, a code of ethics that he never violated. He knew things that many people wanted to know, but he didn't say them if he wasn't allowed to, especially when it came to death. He saw death dates, yes, he did, but he never said anything about it. Never. Why? Because, as he explained, it was not his job, but that of dear Lord. It was not his responsibility to impose this burden on people. He said, "It's enough that I know. I don't need to tell anyone. The Lord God decides when the hour strikes." This humility, this respect for the lives of others made many people trust him. Because they knew that he wasn't boasting about his gift. He carried it because it was his job, not because he wanted to. He described many of his visions with incredible precision. He spoke of cities he had never seen, of people in clothes that no one knew at the time. He described streets, machines, even vehicles that only existed decades later. And yet, he always remained calm. No sensationalism, no stirring up fear. He wanted people to be prepared, but never to panic. Perhaps you can feel it too. this mixture of fascination and awe. Irlmaier's gift was not something he flaunted. It was something that often overwhelmed him. He said that every vision exhausted him, drained his energy, as if part of his own life force was flowing into these images. And yet he faced this task again and again, because he believed that it was his destiny to warn people and comfort them at the same time. In the end, Alois Irlmaier only wanted one thing: for people to retain trust. Trust in the good, in the belief that everything has a purpose in the end. And perhaps that is precisely the most important message of his gift, that even if we walk through the darkest images of the future, we must never lose sight of the light. We are now entering one of the most fascinating and at the same time darkest parts of Alois Irlmaier's prophecies. It is about his warnings of a great war, a war that many interpret as the Third World War. But before we panic or jump to conclusions, let's look together at the pictures Irlmaier drew. Not as stubborn predictions, but as warnings, as hints, perhaps also as opportunities to prevent what is to come. Irlmaier spoke of an event that would mark the beginning of this global catastrophe. He called it the Three High Murders. Imagine that. 3 leading figures, high-ranking politicians, murdered in quick succession. An assassination so shocking that it sends the world into turmoil. And this spark, Irlmaier said, ignited a tremendous fire. He described it like a match falling into a dry field. Everything is prepared. The tension is in the air. All that is missing is that one moment, and then there is no turning back. And that is exactly where the picture Irlmaier so often painted in the minds of his listeners begins. A war that starts overnight, suddenly, insidiously. While people in Western Europe are still sleeping peacefully, tanks roll in from the east. Russian troops, he said, march overnight through Austria into Germany. It happens so quickly that hardly anyone can react, like a blitzkrieg. And here comes one of the details that gives many people goosebumps. Irlmaier spoke of yellow stripes on the tanks, yellow markings that could be seen to recognize these troops. A small, seemingly insignificant piece of information, and yet so precise that it burns itself deep into the memory. He said that the soldiers weren't just coming along the roads. They came over the mountains, through the flat countryside, through the towns. Nobody could believe how fast they were. And while the West is still trying to negotiate, the East has long since arrived. Columns of tanks rolling along highways, airplanes appearing in the sky where no one expected them. The picture is clear. Europe is being taken by surprise. While people still believe it is an exercise, the war is already in full swing. Irlmaier himself drew maps directly on the ground to show his listeners how the fronts would shift. He called these maps the Golden Map. Why golden? Perhaps because the knowledge was considered valuable, or perhaps because he worked with sand or straw, which shone golden in the light. No one knows for sure. But what the people who saw him never forgot was the precision with which he drew these lines. Cities, rivers, directions of advance. He spoke of 3 thrusting wedges pushing westwards at the same time. Imagine that. 3 huge army groups aiming like spearheads at a defenseless country. The north, the center, the south, all advancing, all in sync, as if following a plan written long beforehand. These thrusting wedges were what made the chaos perfect. Irlmaier said that nothing and nobody could stop them. Cities would panic, people fleeing without knowing where, roads clogged, trains overcrowded, cars breaking down. The flight itself would become a danger. And this is where Irlmaier kept repeating his most urgent advice. Leave soon enough. He said that people should leave the cities before the situation escalates, because in the cities, he said, no one was safe anymore. You can feel it in his words. This profound warning not to act out of fear, but out of caution. He never spoke in a lurid tone, but with a calm urgency, as if he wanted to say, I am not telling you this so that you will be afraid, but so that you can prepare yourselves. And when we look at the world today, the tensions, the crises, the conflicts, many people ask themselves, is this the time? Are we already close? The truth is, nobody knows. But Irlmaier's warnings have retained their fascination for decades. Perhaps because they don't come across as clumsy predictions, but rather as a map that shows us where one wrong step could lead. In the end, one message remains. Be vigilant. Pay attention to the signs of the times. Not in fear, but in awareness. Because those who are prepared remain calm. And perhaps this is precisely where hope lies, that knowledge protects us, and that we are still in control of our destiny. Now we come to one of Alois Irlmaier's most impressive and at the same time most mysterious visions. A prophecy that has preoccupied people for decades, not only because it tells of an apocalyptic catastrophe, but also because it gives hope for a new beginning. It is about the 3-day eclipse, an event that Irlmaier described as a touchstone for humanity, as the end of an old world and the beginning of a new one. He spoke of a sign in the sky, a harbinger that would show people that the time had come, a light so bright that no one could ignore it. It will look like a twinkling star, said Irlmaier, growing bigger and bigger. Small at first, like a distant dot in the night sky, but it grows, day by day, until it shines like a second sun. Some speak of a comet, others believe it is a mystical sign from God. Whatever it may be, Irlmaier was certain. When you see this light in the sky, you know that the dark time is near. And then comes the night. But not an ordinary night. It is a darkness like the world has never experienced before. Suddenly it becomes dark, he said, and no more light breaks through. The sun disappears. The moon stays out. The stars go out. A black cloud covers the earth. And not for a few hours, but for a whole 3 days. Imagine that. A world without light. A world in which even the brightest flashlight, the most powerful lamp, no longer gives any light. People close their windows. They barricade their doors. There is a roaring silence. Only the beating of your own heart can be heard. But it's not just the darkness that is frightening. It is the air itself. Irlmaier spoke of sulfur fumes filling the earth, a poisonous breath that seems to come from the ground. Anyone who is outside, who is not prepared, will not survive this breath. His warning was clear. Stay indoors, close windows and doors, seal everything up. But that was not all. He also said, pray. Trust in the good Lord. It was a spiritual test, a time when people were fighting not just for their lives, but for their souls. And this is where the light comes in. Because in this deepest darkness, there is only one light that does not fade, the consecrated candles. Irlmaier said that all other sources of light would fail. No electricity, no lighter. Nothing would work except the candles that were blessed. Their flames burn quietly, without flickering, without going out. It is as if faith itself is burning in this candle, as if God wanted to say, I am with you. You are not alone. Imagine this scene, a small family, locked up in their house, the windows covered, the doors sealed. Outside, a storm is raging that no one can see, but everyone can feel. And in the middle of the room, a single candle is burning. A faint glow, but it dispels the darkness in the room. people sit together, pray, hold hands, for 3 days and 3 nights. It is a test of endurance, of faith, of hope. But as terrible as this time is, it passes. Irlmaier said that after these 3 days, the world was a different place. The air was clean, the water clear. It was as if the earth had taken a deep breath, expelled everything old and made room for the new. The people who survive have understood what really matters. They have returned to a simple life, away from greed, selfishness, and destruction. Back to nature, back to God. And perhaps that is the deepest truth in Irlmaier's vision. That darkness is not the end. It's just a night before the dawn. That even when everything seems lost, we can still carry the light within us. A small flame that has the power to illuminate even the deepest darkness. Irlmaier's words are not empty threats. They are a warning, an invitation to reflect, to be ready, not in fear, but in trust. For those who keep their hearts in the light will survive the darkness. Now we come to perhaps the most important part of Alois Irlmaier's legacy. A message that goes deeper than any prediction of war, darkness, or upheaval. It is the very essence of his visions, and many who met him at the time later said, he didn't want to scare us, he wanted to wake us up. And that's what it's all about now. Irlmaier's prophecies are not a destiny that is immovably fixed. They are a wake-up call, a call to repent, to return to something that we may have long forgotten. Perhaps you have already sensed that something in our world is no longer in balance, that we live in a time in which much shines, but little shines, in which we possess more and more, but are becoming increasingly empty inside. Irlmaier spoke precisely about this. He said that man had lost contact with his origins, to nature, to creation, to God, and that it was precisely this separation that was the real trigger for what he saw in his visions. The wars, the destruction, the darkness. They don't start on the outside. They start in people's hearts. He said, the war begins in ourselves, in our thinking, in our greed, in our ego. And if we don't end these battles within ourselves, they become visible on the outside, in the fields, in the cities, on the streets of the world. But here lies the hope. If the war begins in the heart, then peace can also arise there. And that is precisely Irlmaier's message, that we should not wait until it is too late, that we can act now, that we can turn back. One of the most powerful tools for this, he said, is prayer. Not as an empty formula, not as a duty, but as an honest, sincere conversation with the Creator. Irlmaier repeatedly emphasized that prayer has a power that we often underestimate, that it could not only change our hearts, but also the events themselves. That honest prayer can mitigate fate, like a storm that turns at the last moment, like a fire that is extinguished before it consumes everything. It is not about persuading God. It's about purifying ourselves, remembering who we really are. Because before there is an outer cleansing, there needs to be an inner cleansing. Imagine that the world as we know it is like an old house. The walls are crumbling, the roof is leaking. Time has left its mark. But the house itself, the foundation, is good. And Irlmaier said that the cleaning must come. That old rubble must give way so that new things can emerge. But this cleansing does not begin with machines or violence. It begins within us, by putting our hearts back in order, letting go of the old fears, the anger, the envy, and making space for what heals: love, compassion, humility. He warned urgently against materialism, against the temptation to measure life only by wealth, power, and external successes. Because, he said, this is the path that leads the old world into the abyss. Man has forgotten the Lord God, he said again and again. And with that, the measure has also been lost, the respect, the reverence, not out of fear of punishment, but out of love for creation. But, and this is crucial, Irlmaier also saw hope, great hope. After the time of purification, he said, there will be a new earth, clearer air, purer water, people living in harmony again with each other and with the divine. A society not defined by greed, but by simplicity and gratitude. He spoke of fields that are fertile again, of families coming together, of a return to true joy, not to superficiality, but to a happiness that comes from within. And this new earth, he said, is not for a select elite. It is for those who are now beginning to live in the light, for those who are already walking the path of love and truth today. It is an invitation, not a threat. And that is the key. Irlmaier's visions were never intended as chains, but as keys to a different future, a better one. Perhaps you are asking yourself, what can I do? The answer is simpler than you think. Start with yourself. Become still. Listen to yourself. What does your heart say? Trust in the good. Strengthen your connection to the divine in a way that suits you. And know, every little step counts. Every good word, every act of charity. They are all like candles that light up the darkness. When many candles burn, it becomes light again. Alois Irlmaier was a simple man, and yet he spoke of the greatest truths, not to scare us, but to give us hope, because in the end, there is not darkness. In the end, there is light.